I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome to GM Tools Revealing History.
The history of people, places, and things.
That's right.
So why don't we start off by talking about some of the most common tools that you're going to see in media for the use of revealing history.
So why don't we first talk about what is history when
yes.
it comes to your tabletop RPG or other media that would need to reveal it. Because like we're not talking about like the history class that you took back in school. We're specifically talking about the history, like Linda said, of people, places, and things that are in your setting, that are in your world, that are in your narrative, that are either something that might be relevant to the plot or that kind of builds up flavor and feel for the setting to give the players a sense of what the setting is like and possibly the kind of common sense they can use to intuit what might happen in the setting in the future.
So for people, that history might be, what is the backstory of a particular significant character that it describes their motivations and helps describe how they got to where they are today. So what are the motivations of the villain or an NPC that might be an ally or someone who they just want to know more about in order to understand the story. For a place, it might be, what kinds of significant events happened in this place that helped to tell its story.
That's right. What are the geopolitics of this place that shaped how it was founded? What kind of resources are brought in here? What factions are sort of running around this place and causing any sorts of conflicts or benefits that are in the area?
So that can be on a broad regional scale, or it can be something smaller, like, the classic haunted house type situation where it's like, what happened in this building or what happened in this room.
I know what you did in this room.
And then there's history of things. What are the tales? Is this, a legendary blade that has been handed down through the generations? And then how does that history react with what your characters are doing with that blade today?
That's right. So when we talk about history in these ways, you can see that, as I mentioned before, some of the main uses are either because they'll tie into the plot and the story moving forward, or to sort of tether down the world, to put in details, to give the kind of feel so that people know what to predict. Because history is doomed to repeat itself, even if it doesn't repeat itself in the same way. Things that you said might happen in the history of your setting are also things you might be considering happening later in your story. For example, if your setting has tons of histories of like insurrections and rebellions, maybe you're more likely to have one that's in the plot line of the story than a setting with a history where there were never any insurrections or rebellions at any time. This empire has just run. There are no problems.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that doesn't mean that there won't be one, but it's at least something that people should be considering. Like, their character would be like, oh yeah, I learned about this at school and how there were 50 insurrections in the last 75 years. So I'm kind of expecting to have another insurrection.
Yeah.
Whereas even if your players are like, it's kind of weird this empire has lasted for 1,000 years with 0 insurrections. Their characters are probably just going to be like, it's unthinkable that the immortal emperor would have an insurrection.
Yeah.
So history allows players to kind of come to a sense of common sense about what happened in the past and to tell stories within the story about things that happened. So that's what history is. But now let's get to revealing history, because that's not easy. It's not easy to do. There are some ways of revealing history that are just known to be not the greatest ways of revealing history. One of the most common is a setting Bible that you just hand over to the players. You just you put down like this 200-page document that's like a manifesto of the setting and be like, I've taken this manifesto and everything that's in here is safe for players to read because it doesn't have any of the secrets. That's in my second 800-page manifesto that you can't read. This is all something your characters would know. In fact, they would know all these off the top of their head. I expect you to read and memorize this 200-page document so that you can play your characters successfully in the setting. That is a perfect example of how not to reveal history.
Contrast that with, like, for example, an Adventure Path Player's Guide that may have, like, some very short information that's like, what do your characters definitely know about this location and this kind of thing, regardless of their background. And,
Adventure Path Player's Guide is a good way to reveal some historical details.
Yeah, and it's handled in a much more trim basis, because one of the important things about history when it comes to sort of that outside engagement is you're going to have a broad spectrum of how much your players care. You're going to have players who, they just want to throw the dice and they're not interested in and invested in the history of the setting. And then you're going to have players who will go buy multiple source books so they can read up on the rich detail to flesh out their character's backstory and exactly where they came from and things like that.
Chances are that more of your players are the kind who are like, after an entire year of being forced to go through a 200-page history textbook, were not too happy that they did that, as opposed to the ones who are like, oh my gosh, when I got my 200-page history textbook, the first thing I did was just read the whole thing ahead of the class because it was so cool, and then I memorized it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you need to keep that in mind. Your player's attention span, your player's memory, your player's investment in the history that you've created, all of those are lower than your own investment in the history that you've created by a substantial amount.
Yes. And players tend to be a lot more interested in the pieces of history that directly connect to their characters or directly connect to what their characters are going to be able to do or use. So, if the players are going to be spending the time to learn about, Lady Whatsit and like her history in forming new trade routes between the nations of Northland and Southburg, then like they're gonna be like, okay, why did I learn this? Like, am I gonna run into the ghost of Lady Whatsit? Like, is this gonna become important later? And if that doesn't become important later, then why did you bother learning it?
Then it's in a sense kind of a Chekhov's gun when you give enough detail to something that it seems like it's something that would become important later, or at least like show up later, especially if you give all of it in the beginning. Mm-hmm. So you're gonna need to, first of all, when revealing history, is be judicious. Don't reveal all of history. It is too much for your players. Now, there are many techniques that GMs use to reveal history, and the best way to reveal history is not to lean too much on one of these techniques. Even if you find one and you're like, this one that Mark and Linda said was good, that must mean it's the best one, so I'll only use that one. I'll use it all the time.
No, you're going to want to shake it up.
You definitely want to use a little bit of each one, because it can allow you to insert more history and to get players more engaged. Then even if you find the one that is best for your players and then just give them tons and tons of that, it'll get stale.
So one thing I do want to talk about this too in terms of history is like the perspective that is applied to history, because there's no such thing as a neutral account. So one of the things...
What do you mean, Linda? What if Psychopomps gave history? What if Pharasma gave her history?
Okay, well...
It could be a true neutral
account. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, wait. That has been removed in the remaster.
Mm-hmm.
There are now no such things as neutral accounts.
There you go. So one thing to keep in mind with the method that you're providing it is making it clear to your players what the perspective is that is applied. Is this someone who has an agenda, specific agenda that they might be able to know about? Whether that's an affiliation with a particular organization or desire to promote their ways, or just like, what inherent sense of bias do they have? Is this like, somebody's personal perspective on this? Or is this like the official story told by the winners about this situation? Because, there's going to be things like that are like, perspective based. And then there's going to be aspects of history that are factual in terms of like, yes, like this building was constructed 512 years ago.
Yes,
like,
after a giraffe cannon destroyed the previous building that used to be there. It's just like, yes, that's true.
Yeah. But whenever you're providing that kind of history, I like to keep in mind who created whatever representation the PCs are interacting with, and then what was their slant on it. And might the PCs potentially find a different slant or have a reason to think about the perspective of the person it came from.
That's true. And when they're investigating the ruins of a slant, then they will need to determine whether or not they can believe what they find.
That's true.
Certainly, if they were going into like the Hell Knight Citadel Rivad and finding the Hell Knight Order of the Rax completely accurate new version of history, then they might find that it didn't match with what everyone else was saying about history.
Mm-hmm.
So, when it comes to history, what Linda has indicated about there being multiple takes on history is actually one of the cool ways to reveal history. Is to reveal the same story or the same general facts from a few different sources in your campaign that don't agree with each other. That can be something that can actually get your players interested if they were already engaged enough to remember enough the first time to realize that there were any differences with the later accounts. Otherwise, they might just be like, "Oh, okay," and
Or
whatever
yeah.
your later one was, they just assume that was what you always said in the other times. Especially if you're too subtle with the differences by making them like not the opposite, but like kind of close with a very small change to it.
Yeah, usually when I'm dealing with those kinds of differences, that's why like in a tabletop game I would make those sorts of biases and other things like very obvious, and I'd be like, wow, this person who's talking about this thing is saying that this person was the reason that this nation was founded, and this person is saying that they were actually like a hidden vampire who like actually destroyed things, and then like they murdered this original person, and like if things are extremely different, then that makes it more obvious, particularly if those contradictory accounts are presented very close to each other in time, or if like there's a part of the story that makes finding that history important, like the PCs are trying to research or uncover something.
That's right.
Or like if they have a way for someone to respond to the particular thing that they did. So like, the PCs were figuring out about the history of this. They were going to like this noble party, and they needed to figure out about like the history of these different families. And then like if they mention this one particular thing, then this person gets really upset, and it's like, oh, that's just slander.
Right. So if you have conflicting accounts, you want them to be pretty conflicting. Like, and this is in contrast to non-tabletop RPG histories, where sometimes they might be subtly different. Like, if you're like, haha, I read Mistborn, so I'm gonna do something like that, where there's very slight differences to the wordings of these accounts that are almost exactly the same, and the only way you would even notice if you're like, why did Brandon Sanderson write almost exactly the same thing as I read just a while back? I feel like he just did it again, and then you went back to check, and you saw that it was slightly different. Yeah. If you do that in your tabletop game, it's not going to help. Your players either won't remember that you had the previous time, or if they do, they'll be like, oh, Linda or Mark is repeating it because they probably assumed I forgot it from last time. And furthermore, it's not a book that they can go back into and check the exact wording of what you said the last time anyway, unless you give them a handout, which they probably lost. So
yeah, exactly. The players are not a million people on the internet searching Brandon's book for meaning. The players are people who are thinking about what you're saying in the game, but they're also thinking about like, oh, what are they doing with their characters build, or like, what are they going to do for dinner, that kind of thing. They're not gonna, they're not gonna remember exactly what someone said 3 months ago.
That's right. You're lucky if they were paying enough attention to you to remember it a few minutes after you said it. Oh. So, that is talking about revealing different kinds of history. But what are some of the techniques you could use to reveal history? Now, I teased in the, whatever the heck you call them now, that isn't tweets, about this episode that you don't want to fall too much on the, like, my omnicidal villain wishes to destroy all life on the planet, but is also a very avid diarist and likes to make scrapbooks.
So this is one of the most common. There's nothing
wrong with using that every once in a while, but
it's one of the most common tropes for information delivery. I would say for that one, if you're going to like leave notes, the main pitfall on those is if it feels like that's not something would have written down, or like it's like, oh, this is a message that really should have been destroyed. Why is this place littered with notes that have like the secret codes to get into this bank vault, or like the hidden agenda of this person.
My favorite was the one
as we said.
My favorite was the one that was like, as you know, you should never write this password down. And so, therefore, you should destroy this note at the moment you receive it, since it shouldn't have been written down in the first place. However, I am going to write down that the password for today is blank, as you know. Just as a reminder.
Yeah. Whereas,
It's
like,
like,
if
what?
you have a situation where it does make sense for an NPC to have been writing things down, like, sort of like one of the more classic ones on that is, the NPC who's passed away on the deserted island or whatever, and they wanted to, like, leave a record for someone to find or something like that. Then that sort of thing makes sense. Or, like, if there really was, like, a reason for people to be corresponding via letter, and especially if things were, like, a little bit protected or encrypted, or, like, there was some other obfuscation in it, so it doesn't feel like, this is the text dump that you get and read, but it feels more like, okay, this is something that's naturally happening within the world.
Dear evil pen pal squad, today I summoned a daemon who works for the Archdeacon of War, and said, let's bring war to all of the world forever until we wipe out all life on Earth. And the daemon said, that sounds good to me. Yay! We had a tea party about wiping out life on Earth.
Yep. So
the reason why it's seen as being overdone is a lot of published adventures rely on it, and specifically a lot of adventure paths in a row relied on the diary version. So if your group has never seen that before, you can get away with it, and you probably should use it every once in a while if it hasn't been overdone with your group. But even then, don't go too heavy on it. Make sure, like Linda said, it makes sense. That way, when they find it, it feels like, yes, this person should have had a diary, rather than like, oh, my GM couldn't think of a way to get this information out.
So in terms of why diary gets used a lot, diary is extraordinarily efficient, and diary creates a good reason for there to be a handout where you hand it out to the player and stick it there in front of them, and then they have the ability to check it after the fact.
Yes. So another way,
if you are going to do a diary, another thing to consider closely is how much of the diary entry do you want to show? Because if you only show like 2 sentences of the entry, right, then people are going to be like, oh, well, why did my character zoom in on that particular phrase? But if you show too much, then they're going to get bored.
That's right. If you're like, you found a diary, it's 270 pages long. Here's an excerpt. It says, today I discovered that there might be 50 ghosts that are about to come out of the wall behind the person reading this diary. And then GM says, suddenly 50 ghosts come out of the wall behind you. And
so
you're like, why did I care about that?
Yeah, you usually see like, a solid paragraph, maybe 2 or even 3. But, once you get so much beyond that, then you're really getting into the part where there's too much going on. Or like, maybe excerpts from a few different days if those days are short and are starting to show something that's a contrast over time.
So diaries, like, they're okay. Don't overuse them. Especially if you want to, like, draw doodles that they're drawing in the diary, or make some kind of physical representation of it to hand to your players, they can have an effect and be effective, but they can get overdone. What I think, I'm going to say, don't overuse this one either, but is the best way to reveal history, as long as you use it sparingly in most cases, is some sort of weird vision or other interactive event that reveals the history.
So, for example, a haunt.
Haunts?
Or a ghost, or
haunts
a mystical
can get
vision.
You somewhere. Haunts are on the way towards this. They don't always get you all the way there, but they have a lot of the benefits of the vision of the actual history, because A, you can make the haunt have a vision of history, in which case they kind of got most of the rest of the way, if not all the rest of the way there, depending on what the haunt is. B, if you want to get rid of the haunt, you may be forced to actually pay attention to the history, because its unfinished business could be revealed by paying attention to the haunt. But haunts are one great example of this, and other examples are just like weird paranormal magical effects, the type of which would appear in the Dark Archive, and or examples of those phenomena where like characters find themselves like weirdly playing out the actions of other people from the past, a la like Final Fantasy VIII, where you're just like, what's even going on? I don't know. I've done that before in a campaign that I was running, which allowed people to see like what one of the BBEGs was doing. It was like an Arthurian adventure, but like there was like a flashback where they played some Roman characters who were in the area like a while before that time, and they had to deal with an evil mage who then there was another later flashback to a group that was like in Ireland a while before that and fought the same person. And so that allowed people to realize, because their characters were actually seeing the flashbacks, and I had them just play these pre-generated characters who died in the fight against the opponent each time. And they learned a little bit about the tactics and like the personality. Because the first time I ran that, the group of defenders in the Irish group actually, they didn't quite lose. They had one berserker barbarian who, like, the bad guys group could not kill, and he and the others actually killed everyone except the leader from the enemy group. The enemy group is like, I guess you're not gonna die until that frenzy wears off. I can't kill you. He was like, I salute you, you win. And he teleported away. And then the berserker died, and then the villain teleported back and did what he was gonna do. And that's sort of like, the players even saw that, even though the characters they had been playing had all died at that point in time. That gave them a sense of like the style and the tactics of that villain that they were dealing with. And the way that he wasn't too prideful to be like, no, I'll just keep fighting this barbarian and bash my head against this barbarian I can't beat, but instead was more willing to take a loss, praise his opponent, and then actually win.
And another important thing about that is that the history is broken up into parts. You didn't try to like give it all at once, but there's lots of different pieces that let you put it together.
It was
like,
when they went to the ruins that the bad guys got into first. They also got to see what the dungeon looked like before it was ruined in both cases. But because it revealed some of the like the layout, it happened like after they had mostly explored the dungeon in both cases.
You can also do stuff with, like, you know, different carvings or inscriptions that depict certain events that may be like, okay, this gives you a sense of what things were like, but this isn't telling you the entire story. It might tell you something about, like, what the culture that built that particular building valued.
Yes.
Or what the building's purpose was.
To give another example of when I use this technique, so one example of an adventure where like everybody kind of has a journal, but also some people don't have a journal, and they are people who have a very long backstory that you might not otherwise really hear a lot about. Like Burnt Offerings in the beginning of Rise of the Rune Lords, the first villain has a very long traumatic backstory. And if I recall correctly, her lieutenant has a journal with like lewd pictures of her in it, but she didn't even necessarily have a journal, or if she did write notes, they were like only saying some of the information. And I thought it would be interesting for the PCs to see like exactly what went on in backstory. So like she had been raised in a Desmond household that did not treat her well, but I decided that they gave her like a dream talisman that like stored, is supposedly gonna be like, you know, store your memories and your dreams that you can like think about them. And because of her traumatic past, what it wound up storing recently are all horrific nightmares. Also, she worships Lamash, the goddess of nightmares now, so it's full of nightmares. And then on her turn at the beginning of combat, she released the nightmares on the PCs. Which the PCs who failed their save wound up like losing some of their turns as they were lost in these nightmares, navigating through them, and they saw these scenes from her past. And it revealed more elements of her backstory that were in this very, very long description of her backstory that's in the adventure. And then afterwards, they were able to recognize what had gone on with her, and that caused the Paladin of Sarenrae to like really want to redeem her afterwards, because she did not fail her save, because it's Pathfinder 1, where Paladins never fail a saving throw except on a natural 1. But she heard about it from one of the people who did.
Yeah.
So that's another example, just to show I definitely use this vision or playing out through it or having it happen in play technique, because it allows me to give all 5 senses towards the players. They get immersed in it, and it's happening during a moment they're paying attention to, such as the big fight.
One of the other classic methods is talk to the NPC expert. So this can take a variety of means. One of them is the villainous monologue, where the villain decides to speak at length about their motivation and what their plans and what they've been trying to do and things like that.
Now I will explain my entire evil plan to you.
Which works for some villains, but not for others. And for some playstyles, but not for others. There's also like the NPC like monologues on about something. Usually that kind of thing works better when there's interactivity to it. So like the PCs want to learn about a particular thing, and then there is an option for how much they want to delve into it. So you look at, for example, the
Q&As.
The Q&As at the beginning of a typical Pathfinder or Starfinder Society scenario. The person who's giving the mission briefing will give the PCs the information that they need to have to do the adventure. And then there's an ability for the PCs to ask more questions to gain more details about like certain events or things that were mentioned in that briefing. But like if they don't ask those questions, the NPC will just make sure they have like the key information before they leave, and then they don't interact with more history than they care about. But they have a choice to do that.
That's right. So an interactive Q&A is a great way to do it as well. Both the Q&A and the weird interactive visions are utilizing the same techniques that led video game developers to stop putting in instruction manuals with games, instead make tutorial levels where you just kind of go into it and you can interact with things in the way that you want to do to learn stuff. Because it's easier to engage your players if you basically have them involved like that.
Another thing that you can do is reveal the information as it's relevant in the moment. So when something comes up, then there can be a recall knowledge check to tell the player the relevant information that their character would know in this particular situation. So they don't need to know like the entire treatise. They just know your character knows.
That gives the illusion that they've read your 200-page manifesto by giving all the relevant information at the right time. And an example of that also, it helps if one of the players is playing a character who really wants to know the history. So, like, for example, in War for the Crown Book 5, the kind of like architectural, archaeological, and art history of the entire first dungeon is explained in extreme detail about like which Taldan art movement like did which renovation at which point in time in this place. And Linda's character was like an extremely art focused armor smith who had like the art scene lore as her lore from her background. And so like I just rolled for her on every room and then based on her result like just read some of the things while the other players were like doing something else, or I gave them the description or a puzzle and something to interact with that I just read to Linda and anyone else who could listen, because I was like, Linda, did your character tell everyone this in each room?
Absolutely.
And Linda was like, no. Linda was like, even if they tell me not to,
she's gonna
she will. So I was like, all right, so she says this, and then I'll describe like.
And you can tune it out.
It's like, and then this one looks like it was made in the second Taldan movement, but it was clearly renovated by the fifth movement, because you can see since the way that it was replaced in these things is less stylized. They clearly didn't know exactly what they were replacing, so some of the elements must have been lost, because if they had perfectly reproduced the second Taldan movement,
and that was really fun too,
like
to have the other people like literally grab my character and be like, "We're moving to the next encounter," just like, but the history. Nope, we need our shield fighter. Stop gawking at the Scots.
Stop rolling lore, fighter. Just put your shield up.
Yup.
So that one worked as well. That one works in the sense of the guided museum tour, where every time you go into a place, like the guide, like the little. But
that was also like because you knew the character and the player, and that character's shtick was all about being the historian.
You can consider that when you're building your own adventure as well, doing a guided museum tour type thing, where a little piece of lore or two is revealed in each room, and there's something interesting about it. Maybe tie it into the counter that's in that room too, where it's like, well, this is where they they buried their dead in these niches in the wall, and then undead come out of it or something like that.
Yeah, it's like, because you were paying attention to that, then you know this particular thing.
And where you can roll religion for initiative against this because you knew that they buried their dead in these niches in the walls.
Mm-hmm. But you often have that kind of things in like society scenarios too, because there is that interest in like the history and the archaeology of places, and then you might have like, oh yeah, the secondary success. To get a full success on this adventure, you need to discover some number of these clues that tie back to the history of the place. And with history, I think another thing to keep in mind is that, you don't have to tell the full story. You can leave mysteries, you can leave, hanging edges, as long as there's enough to like start to spin a shape, and then if the players latch onto that and they want to learn more about it, then you can give them opportunities to explore that thing further.
They might come up with a theory that was better than your original idea, but that fits with the little pieces that you gave them so far.
And then that suddenly becomes what was true all along.
Yeah, absolutely. So all of these are useful for techniques for revealing history. So to recap briefly, the main techniques are written records. And NPCs tells you about it. Your PC technically knows, but the GM just didn't. As the GM, you don't tell the PC until like the appropriate time, sort of like a guided tour where each area reveals an additional fact, or like the loading screen where you put up a tip. And weird visions or out-of-body experiences where you play a different character or see the visions that happened in the past of somebody else.
I'd like to go on a related tangent, which is something about the details of how you reveal history, which is the effect of time. If something was a very long time ago, how are you going to portray the way that different objects will have decayed? How are you going to portray the uncertainty that is introduced into any sort of record of what happened back then? You might have something where it's like, well, this is written in an older language that nobody speaks nowadays, or like, the things that were in paper here have all crumbled away, so the only things that are left are stone. So those remnant, or there are like the only things that are left are like this portion of the inscription, because the rest has been broken. So the effect of time really helps to show things, because it definitely breaks verisimilitude if you're like, yes, this place is 1,000 years old and you can still see the table that's completely fine. If you want to do stuff like that, then you'll want to say like, this place was magically preserved, and then it's like, why was this place magically preserved? And then that becomes part of the story too. There's also the story of like, who else has, for locations and items and things like that in particular, like who else has interacted with this place? Like in a lot of buildings that you're going to have are going to have had many uses over the years. Was this place like, originally a mausoleum and then repurposed to be like a prison, and then repurposed to be like smuggling tunnels,
and then after that a miniature golf course?
Yeah, like what was this place's history? And so you may have layers upon layers that are discovered. But to avoid confusion in that, you'll want to have some kind of sign that that you have different layers in it. Like, it's like, oh yeah, you can see the original architecture, and then you can see the place where like, this portion was hacked off, and then they stuck a table in here so they could have more space for whatever.
They put holes in like a big clown head at the end of the smuggling tunnel.
Yeah. So they can so you can show how things have changed around over time.
Yep. So sometimes that gets into one of the other ways to reveal history, which is somewhat dangerous in tabletop RPGs, but can be effective, especially if you have a very perceptive group, which is subtly revealing history by showing and not telling, by just like sort of putting the effects of history in and leaving it to your players to extrapolate or to ask questions and be like, I wonder why this little tunnel was off there in the first place where the clown head is in the mini golf course. It seems weird that they built it like that. And then try to analyze it or ask the person who owns it, and like, oh yeah, that's because smugglers took over this place after it was a catacomb.
But you can do a slight variant of that, for example, where instead of expecting them to notice that, you might have a thing where it's like, okay, do you have anyone who's searching? Then you might roll a perception check for them to notice, like, oh, there's like this weird... There's like a remnant of a money sack here, or like an object that was being smuggled. And then it becomes
the guided tour version or the just-in-time information version, where you give them the information just in time. Now, that's usually better. One reason that you might use the only after they ask you version is if you didn't think of that and you're like, oh yeah, I just wanted to put a clown head in there and in a side tunnel. But they're right. It kind of is weird that there would be a side tunnel in these catacombs. I guess there was a smuggler usage in between the catacomb usage and the mini golf usage.
Yes.
So that is a way to do it, is to sort of like square the circle on the history, and that like building history because the players ask questions or are unsure, like why is that actually, is you definitely want, if you can, if you're good enough at improvising, to build history at that point, even if you don't have an answer, because depending on your group, maybe your group is curious about everything, but for most groups, the fact that they ask that question is put this in like the top 20% of engagement that they've ever had with the history of an area that you've gone into. And so they really care, and you don't want to
be like,
make the answer to whatever, it was just there, because then you will make it less likely that they'll ask you the next time. So if it's actually interesting and they find out about the smugglers and then they use that because they knew about the smugglers, they find a hidden treasure that the smugglers left behind that the people from the catacomb golf didn't know was in there, because they didn't know about the intermediate smuggler usage.
Because they were taking a closer look at the clown, and that meant that they found that there was a secret door if you press the clown's nose, and then therefore you open
that teaches the players that asking you questions and trying to understand the historical context finds them a secret treasure, which is a better lesson to learn than asking for historical context, cause my GM to like throw all the papers with notes up in the air, rip their hair out, and then scream, "Why are you asking me this? I don't know."
Yep. Well, I think it's sort of the idea of like, you know, if the players ask what's behind the door, you know, you don't want the answer to be what's behind the door is a perfectly white wall, with no perfectly white featureless wall, or like
if the players ask you what's behind the door, okay, and the answer was actually a white wall somehow, or like you didn't know what was behind the door.
Well, I think the most common one of that is like the tunnel that is beyond the scope of the adventure.
You could do the tunnel beyond the scope of the adventure,
but how do you handle the tunnel? I was going to get into that too.
Yeah, another possible way to deal with what's behind the door when it's beyond this, or the tunnel when it's beyond the scope of the adventure, right? If they really seem interested in it, is suddenly there's an explosion or something like that, and be like, and we'll start back here next time. And then that way you have an entire session to figure out what the heck was behind that door, because of the fact that you've left them on a cliffhanger of what was behind the door that you have no idea, and you would need a lot of time to figure out what was behind it.
One thing that I've done,
and then they'll never forget that door because they were worried about it the entire time.
Or, like, with those tunnels that are beyond the scope of the adventures, like, Mark knows some of the things that I've done is, like, you know, throwing in some random encounters, and then it's like, you can tell that you're descending deeper into the dark lands. It seems like, you know, this tunnel hasn't been used in a while for these things, but, like, you can tell, like, you're going into another location, and if you wanted to, maybe you'd run into an NPC that you can talk to who knows a little bit more about what's going on up top, or what the history of was with people up there, but, like, you can, you know, it's not necessarily true that every door is going to have something that is completely relevant to the plot, but if you can have something that's beyond it, then they can be like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, maybe this gives them another way to, like, enter and exit so they can sneak out of the building and and befriend the creatures that are down there and have them give them cover or what have you.
I once had a tunnel outside the scope of the adventure that went to the Dark Lands too. There are a lot of them in Paizo Adventures. And my group went down it just in case the enemies were going there. I let them for a while, then I had them identify like a huge fungus monster that was in the distance as being like 10 levels higher than them. And they were like, let's not go in there because it's 10 levels higher than us. And they turned around.
Yep.
But if they wanted to fight the 10 levels higher than them fungus monster that wasn't attacking them, then they could have.
Yes, that's the tunnel of random encounters. Bear, shadow, dragon, maybe even a shark. Shuffle and cut the best of your battle cards. And
you never know. And Kitsune Warlock said that he wrote his campaign assuming players would metagame Golarian knowledge, but after 2-year schedule conflicts made most of the party new to the setting, he had to adjust the revelation plans a little bit for that. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you have a group of Theseus where just like almost nobody is left from the beginning. And
then you have like the game's history, honestly, that you've got to reveal too to them.
In my Rise of the Runelords game, the only player who was around from the beginning to the end was Linda.
Mm-hmm.
And most of their characters, of the other characters, had died too. But,
And the ones who hadn't,
the ones who did
retired,
retire,
yeah.
but that was because the players left, of course, because only one player was left.
Mm-hmm.
But so like that, you lose a lot of like the legacy and the continuity when that happens.
And the
can
knowledge
make it
of the
tricky.
history and the history of what the players have done and those kinds of things. But fortunately, when new characters come in, the new characters aren't expected to be as encyclopedically knowledgeable about what happened before. So, you know, you can reveal things in that same way. Like, you probably don't want to be like, and you came into the AP in part 4. Here's what happened in the first 3 parts of the AP, Funk. But, like, you know, a broad scope summary of, like, some of the major beats that takes just a couple minutes to go over, and then you can zoom in more on things.
What if the new players come in as, like, an investigator or someone, and their character's name is Encyclopedia Brown, and they're expected to know an encyclopedic information of everything?
Okay, like, if somebody came in and was like, my deal is I'm an investigator who's been specifically investigating this party and knows all about them, then that is a big, giant, flashing, hey, GM, this player wants more information.
What if the player doesn't want the information?
If the player doesn't want the information and they just want their character to be extremely knowledgeable about the party,
yes.
Then in that case, there's another technique we haven't talked about here. There's the rolling technique, and then there's also your character would, you know, it's like your character would know X, Y, Z.
There's also
technique.
the let other players help the character who's supposed to know technique.
Yes.
So there's a big difference if the player who comes in is Encyclopedia Brown, the investigator who's studied up on this entire party, and if the player is Bugs Meany, the barbarian who wants to beat people up with his fists, and who doesn't care about anything, no matter how many times you tell him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just like, you know, if you have somebody who's playing, you know, like a character who has like 30 intelligence or some ridiculous thing that no actual person has, then having some of those kinds of things where it's like, you know, the GM could just be like, yeah, you know what, you're a cleric of Sarenrae. You are aware of these basic things about Sarenrae. You don't need to roll a check, or like, you know, you have learned and read about these sorts of things. And you can handle that either saying that to them out loud or like passing them a note with that information if only their character would be the one to know it, or you know, you can even do something where you know, I know every GM has kind of like a different level on when they do this, but like, you know, if the player says that their character is going to do something and that, you know, really doesn't match with what you know that character would know, you know, the sort of extreme example of this that we use, like, it talking about this philosophically in our home group was like, you know, a character that walks 10 feet that way, 10 feet north, because the player didn't know there was a cliff there, but the character clearly would know they were about to walk up a cliff. But, you know, the less extreme examples of that where it's like, you know, the player says something that's really going to tick off an NPC, whereas their character clearly knows that's going to tick off the NPC, and then you check and you're like, yeah, you know, your character, just as a reminder, you know, from a couple sessions ago, your character knows that this kind of thing, had discovered this kind of thing as a pain point for that NPC. And then they might say, oh, never mind, right, I did know that, I shouldn't have said that. Or, you know, they're like, yeah, let's do it. And it's like, all right, here we go. Because you don't want players to feel like because, you know, nobody is going to be able to be as invested in what's going on with their characters as their characters would be in their own lives. So, like, giving latitude for the fact that you'll have less investment in memory than, like, the character would. And giving them that other information. And then they can, you know, they can still make those decisions, but you're just letting them know what their character would have at their disposal.
Absolutely. So we talked about various different ways to reveal history, whether it's in-game or sort of out-of-game, that the information is found. Out-of-game meaning that, like, the character actually really already knew it, but you just didn't make the player figure it out until it became relevant with a sort of waiting and doing a last-minute evaluation of the information right when it became relevant.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you know, the rule of Dungeon Craft, where you shouldn't, like, completely flesh out everything that the players aren't going to.
But in this case, you did flesh it out, but you didn't have to tell them. So it's also like programming just in time. Sort of calls for information or doing something.
So yeah, and your prep, you know, if you're, depending on your level of improvisation, you can decide how much detail work you want to get into building the history in advance. It's usually good to have at least some sense of it so that you can anchor off of it. But, you know, it's up to you how detailed you want to go and how much you want to improvise.
That's right. So, does anyone in chat have any questions about how you've needed to deal with history in your game, or other issues that have come up with revealing the history of people, places, or things in your settings, in your adventures, both ones that you've written yourself or pre-published ones? 'Cause if not, I think I got through most of the tips and advice that I wanted to get through. Just remember again, of the ones we rated here and said some of them were good techniques, some of them weren't as good of techniques. No technique is good if you just repeat it over and over again. Variety in techniques is always the best way to keep things fresh. So there's a question about opinions on having to change revealed history. You can always go, that was an unreliable narrator, but is that cheap? So I think it was maybe before you were on the show, but we even mentioned it can be good to, if history, which is always biased and is never a truly neutral history, now that the remaster got rid of Pharasma being true neutral, is that history, since it has multiple narrators, always is going to have some contradictions. But you do want to kind of make sure that the contradictions are not ridiculously subtle between them, but that are like fairly obviously different from each other.
And I think generally, if you want to, it's better if you want to portray an unreliable source for there to be some way that players can figure out that that source may have the bias that is inherent in that particular source. So, you know, you could totally be like, oh yeah, you know, you researched this in the library of, you know, the Grand Magus Academy, and then like the players had thought, oh, the Grand Magus Academy is really reliable, and then they later figure out, oh well, it's like all of that was wrong. You know, before you reveal, or as a part of revealing all of that was wrong, you probably want to then have a plot about like, oh yeah, you know, there's this person who's this historian affiliated with the Grand Magus Academy who's been like doctoring documents or like bringing things in. So there's some way, so it isn't just like, oh yeah, all this stuff. It doesn't feel as much like a retcon as like, oh, here's a plot lead.
Yep. Sometimes with unreliable narrators, it can even pay, especially if it seems like a definitive source, to have like a secondary narrator who's narrating the primary source and even says that is like, this part of it is definitely wrong. So, like, for example, in The Balance, one of the religions in the World of Battle Zoo Indigo Isles Kickstarter that is currently active at the time that we were filming this video at kickstarter.rollforcombat.com, there are some followers of the deities of life and death, Awaz and Zoa, who believe that Awaz and Zoa created life and death in the world of Alucard. However, the entry on them says that not only is this obviously wrong, but the deities themselves have admitted that they definitely didn't. Because they were born, aka something that was born, to their parents who came from another dimension to Alucard, a world that had people who, and this is true, were being born and dying before their parents got there, and that there were problems with too many deaths. And so they had these children, so it was clearly obvious that they're Orthodox priests who believe that like they created all of life and death are wrong, and even their own deities will admit it, but they're like, no, but they did. In reality, they regulate the processes to make them run more smoothly. So in that case, you even see that those priests are under unreliable narrator, and those priests are mentioned again because in the religion, the Eld, which has the 20 elements, 2 of which are life and death, the Eld is a religion that's older than the Balance, and life and death are 2 of the elements that have been around the entire time, and it mentions that the Eld and the Balance priests mostly get along-ish, but that they really don't get along with those really orthodox priests of Awaz and Zoa who claim that, no, our deities created life and death, because they're like, no, you didn't.
It may also be, you know, that the source is one that it would generally be trustworthy, but there's something about that particular topic that makes it not trustworthy. Like, you know, were they taken in by a primary source that they were then following that had some facts incorrect, or that sort of thing, or what else is going on?
Did someone have propaganda? Another thing in the same book, Moloi, the god of the oceans, like, claimed to have created the Chochori ancestry, even though Chochori history dates back to before Moloi was born, and most Chochori are pretty confident that that did not happen. But the claim was the very first of Moloi's sacred texts was written on coral. That coral came to life and became the first Chochori, which is like fairly obviously untrue, but was propagated and promulgated by Malloy, who just like it's to his advantage to try to claim this because he tries to claim the oceans as his own domain and say that you have to pay him tribute if you go on them ever. So like he's just the kind of guy who would make those claims. And so like having unreliable narrators that you call a few of them out yourself means that if there are other unreliable narrators in there, then no one's gonna be that shocked.
It doesn't feel like a gotcha.
Whereas if you never call them out and you just like present it like wide-eyed and credulously about everything that's stated in your book, then if anything in it is an unreliable narrator, it makes the people
players
reading
feel
your
like,
book.
oh, you just
like,
retcon that. Yeah.
Whereas if they've read it and they've been like, oh yeah, I remember like multiple times that you mentioned unreliable narrators. So the fact that this one was also unreliable is not that unsurprising, or is it not that surprising? Not that unsurprising.
I see another comment here from Rico. Has a player who's super interested in history right up until it's relevant to the actual campaign.
Wow, that's like the opposite of usual.
So
many players are interested when it is relevant.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that particular one before. Is it like more...
That reminds me of my cousin who, when I was trying to ask him what he was studying, he was like, algebraic geometry. I was like, in what way are you applying algebraic geometry? And he bristled. He was like, what? I specifically am only studying the ones that have no applications, not ones that could possibly be applied. I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. He's like, no, I wanted to make sure no one could ever use this. And he was like very, very strident about it. I was like, okay, cool. Mm-hmm. I wasn't impugning that you were going to apply this to something.
Yeah. So I see history major. So I see. So maybe it's more interested in maybe it's more about being interested in the pace at which you process the information when you read it, and you're looking at like the grand arc of the story as opposed to like interacting with those smaller pieces. I could see that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Assuming Warlock says, you could recall knowledge. Are these runes Aslanti or Thessalonian? Or you could ask, are you sure you don't want to strike the rune giant attacking you?
I've made my choices, yeah.
Yep.
Well, it's just sort of like when that's one where like players go and investigate things, and because you described the room and what's in it, and they forget that you said there was a dangerous creature in there.
Sometimes that's because you read the box text.
Yeah.
And as our viewers know, I am not very pro the Paizo and some other major publishers' line of putting in box text that because it needs to assume that the monster could have done something else and been somewhere else does not include the very obvious monster that's supposed to be in the room in the box text. I'm very against that. I say either don't put in box text and just put all that information in a non-box text, or put in box text that puts the monster with a note that like if the monster's not there, then don't read that part of the box text. Because it just is, it's so egregious when you read for 12 lines all these details, and it's like there's these lines of books. The third book on the top row is an emerald green spine,
and there's no way you notice
it's written in dwarven runes, and the candelabra has 72 different stones on it. And each of the candles has the shape of a different deity from each of which is represented in the ancient Ninshiborian way. And you read this entire thing, it's like, also there was a giant dragon that tried to murder you the instant you stepped into this room.
Yeah. So like when I present those kinds of rooms, it's like, all that? Yeah, it'll be like, yeah, you walk into a room. It's a giant library with tall ceilings. But what's more relevant about this room is that there's a giant dragon. And they're bearing their fangs at you. Mm-hmm. And as their saliva falls to the ground, it burns tiny holes in the remnants of the carpet or whatever. And then afterwards, it's like, okay, yeah, you defeated the dragon. And it's like, oh yeah, let's look around the room. And then it's like, yes, well, now that you defeated the dragon, one of the main features of the room is a dragon corpse in the center of the room. Other than that...
Numbat says she's resorted to a general brief impression of the room, but you're distracted by the giant dragon. Mm-hmm. Yes. Absolutely. So, like, yes, I'm very bearish on the here's a very long description of the room, which doesn't include the monster in case
Oh my
the
god,
monster was somewhere
Rico
else.
has like a list of gazebo moments here. You can't paralyze fire. You can't charm a pepper. You can't intimidate timber. Clay isn't titanium. Fire cannot be trapped in an extra-dimensional maze. Belgium does not exist on Golarion. That's amazing. All actual quotes from an Age of Ashes
Of
campaign.
all of those, I think that Belgians being in Galarian would be the most likely if there was one, like, Belgian prisoner of war of, like, who was with the Russian troop that got brought in over in Baba Yaga's hut or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's still very unlikely. Yeah, see, Sean Wolf
Yeah,
said
yeah,
the same
yeah.
thing that I said. They were looking for Belgian ale. I don't know, maybe Belgian waffles to use
Yeah,
their
their
mithril nonstick waffle
Yep,
iron
yep.
to make Belgian waffles.
Everybody knows mithril nonstick waffle irons. A+ purchase.
Very important. They were so important that I had to add them
back into second
edition when I was going to what was it? The Grand Bazaar.
Grand Bazaar, yeah.
And we were copy fitting, so I was just like, "This is it. I'm doing this."
Yeah, Rika said not on the planet. Note that you didn't say.
Oh, it said on the planet.
Yeah,
not
on the
planet.
planet.
Now that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I was just like, "We're doing this." The Milani waffle iron that was said to be used by literally Milani. Reign of Winter 2, the search for Belgian waffles confirmed. The new well, you know, Shen, I saw someone recently was complaining on like Reddit or something. It was like, why do we with PF1 have Reign of Winter, but PF2 does not have Reign of Winter? And people were like, I don't know, Gatewalkers is pretty wild. They were like, no, but it had Reign of Winter. So the only thing that they would want is exactly that, Shad. But it would have to be Reign of Winter 2, the search for Belgian waffles. That's what they're looking for.
Yeah, I see, Rico, you didn't want to go into hypothetically they could go and Earth and yada yada. Yeah.
Yes. They would be able to, but it would wind up being like pretty old because it would be like from the 19.
I find that for those kinds of things, like sometimes I'll take a look at like, okay, you know, which nation in Golarion seems to be most closely inspired by this real world country? Okay, you know, you can, okay, this one maybe is the one that has, or just pick some place that might have something somewhat analogous.
Considering Warlock defeated Baba Yaga in Starfighter 2 days ago, I'm actually very impressed by Baba Yaga that she survived that long.
That's legit.
Like, that's quite a hustle, even for an ancient being like Baba Yaga, to make it like all the way through the timeline.
Yeah, Andron waffles. I could totally see that.
Through the time of Starfinder. Like, even though maybe she may have been killed by your low-level Starfinder party, even making it that far is pretty good. There aren't that many characters that can say that they did.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I think we made it through revealing history. So let's say goodbye to YouTube and then do our outro and figure out what our next episode will be. Bye, YouTube.
Bye,
See you
YouTube.
next time.